Good morning. As those of you who experienced this know, you don't walk around with these on. Bad things happen, right? Doesn't feel so good. This morning we're reading from Luke 8:26 through 39. So they arrived in the region of the Gerasenes. Sorry, I checked that before I left home. Across the lake from Galilee. As Jesus was climbing out of the boat, a man who was possessed by demons came out to meet him. For a long time he had been homeless and naked, living in the tombs outside of town. As soon as he saw Jesus, he shrieked and fell down in front of him. Then he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Please, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already commanded the evil spirit to come out of him. This spirit had often taken control of the man. Even when he was placed under guard and put in chains and shackles, he simply broke them and rushed out into the wilderness, completely under the demon's power. Jesus demanded, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, for he was filled with many demons. The demons kept begging Jesus not to send them into the bottomless pit. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby, and the demons begged him to let them enter the pigs. So Jesus gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the entire herd plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned. When the herdsmen saw it, they fled to the nearby town and surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran. People rushed out to see what had happened. A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been freed of the demons. He was sitting at Jesus' feet, fully clothed and perfectly sane, and they were all afraid. Then those who had seen what happened told the others how the demon-possessed man had been healed. And all of the people in the region of the Gerasenes begged Jesus to go away and leave them alone, for a great wave of fear swept over them. So Jesus returned to the boat and left, crossing back to the other side of the lake. The man who had been freed from the demons begged to go with him, but Jesus sent him home, saying, "No, go back to your family and tell them everything God has done for you." So he went all through the town, proclaiming the great things Jesus had done for him. The word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God.
Good morning, everyone. Today is going to be a great day. Going to pick up John this afternoon. He's been gone for 11 months, and we're excited for him to come home. He will be home for about a month, and then he's taking off again. But he won't be gone as long this time. I think he's going to be gone for about 3 months. So he'll be back home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, which he let us know last year. He and those in his squad really missed being home at Thanksgiving and Christmas. So we're glad that he's going to be here. He will have to raise a little money, but not near as much as he did when he left on this 11-month missionary tour. So we're excited. What's that? When's Justin coming home? Next month. So. They've both been on missions, just different missions of a different sort. When Diana prayed this morning, she talked about the demons that we all face. And I want to talk about that a little this morning in just a little while. First of all, a couple of weeks ago, Pentecost Sunday, we heard about how the disciples of Jesus, under the power of the Holy Spirit, miraculously began to speak to those who were visiting from other nations. They began to speak to them in their own language. And since they were speaking to these foreign visitors in a language they had never studied, it was truly a miraculous event. But even more so was the content of what they were saying. For these believers were relaying something to this international gathering that they themselves had witnessed and experienced. That a man who had lived and worked among them had performed great signs and wonders, and then had been crucified, dead, and buried, and had actually risen from the dead and spent time among them prior to ascending into heaven. What's more, he did this willingly as a sacrifice to atone for their sins. Wow, that's a lot to unpack. Of course, there were not a few that day who ridiculed them and accused them of having imbibed too much wine. Now, I don't know if it was the speaking in tongues that they were ridiculing or their absolutely scandalous message that a treasonous criminal had actually come back to life and ascended into heaven. A criminal that these lunatics were now claiming as God. So, perhaps it was a little bit of both. I'll leave it up to you to decide which one of these things that they were ridiculing. But remember this, the Apostle Paul referred to the content of the gospel as a scandal. In the book of Romans, he says the gospel is something of which he is not ashamed in spite of the outlandish claims it makes. To the Corinthians, he said the same content was foolishness to those who do not believe. But regardless of whether it seems foolish or outlandish or impossible or scandalous, it is nevertheless historically verifiable. Luke tells us in the very first chapter of his book, right off the bat, first 4 verses, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. In other words, Luke has carefully investigated all of the accounts about Jesus that were at that time being circulated. And many of them simply were not reliable. He doesn't want to make the mistake of passing on spurious information about this man because, one, he has a respect for the truth. And two, he doesn't want to risk his life or the life of someone else for something that may turn out to be false. After all, what happened to their master may very well happened to the followers. So if he's going to commit something to writing, he wants to be sure that he is passing on factual information. He doesn't want to be responsible for passing on information that could easily get some folks killed if it's not true. And because Luke is so meticulous and careful in his account to not record anything speculative or based on hearsay, we can have confidence that what he says in his account is true. And so, because it is true, certain questions arise about why things happened as they did. Take, for example, our case in today's reading. The question here is, why did Jesus decide to go clear across the Sea of Galilee to an area inhabited primarily by Gentiles, especially when we remember that he himself said he was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel? In other words, the Jews. And then, why did he return immediately after the events that take place in today's reading back to the area of Capernaum where he had been ministering to begin with? Now, if Luke were inventing this story out of whole cloth, these would not be the kinds of incidents that would have made it into the story because they are so improbable. But ironically, it is his very inclusion of these events that render his story all the more trustworthy, because that's just how real life is. It's complicated. It does things that you wouldn't expect. So, let's take a closer look at these events and see if we can make some sense of them. After a season of preaching, teaching, delivering others from possession by evil spirits, sharing parables with his followers, he directs those of his inner circle to board a small sailing vessel to cross the Sea of Galilee. And he's not just going straight across the sea from west to east, a distance of some 4 to 5 miles. They are sailing from the area in or around Capernaum, where he was ministering, situated on the northwestern coast of the Sea of Galilee, to the very opposite end on the southeastern shore near a region called the Decapolis, a distance of some 10 to 12 miles. This is no random journey. Jesus has in mind a specific purpose for this journey that only he could have known. He doesn't share with his disciples what that purpose is. They'll know soon enough. But as they're on their way to their destination, Luke tells us in chapter 8, verses 22 through 25, that a violent storm catches them several miles out to sea. The boat begins taking on water and is in danger of sinking. Everyone on the vessel is in fear of perishing, except for one, Jesus, who is asleep in the stern, while utter chaos rages around him, both in the sea and on the boat. It's now all hands on deck to try to save the vessel and themselves. And apparently Jesus is a sound sleeper, because they actually have to wake him in this storm. What does he do upon waking? Is he cranky and ill? Does he turn over and pull the covers back over himself? Does he demand a cup of coffee? No, he gets up and he rebukes the wind and the waves, and immediately the storm-tossed vessel is righted as the water once again becomes just as calm as it was when they first put out to sea. But rather than rejoicing and thanking God for delivering them from certain death, the disciples are instead filled with a paralyzing fear. Why? After all, this is Jesus that they're with. It's easy for us on this side of the cross to ask that question of the disciples, because the Jesus some of us serve is oftentimes a tame Jesus. He's no longer the uncontrollable lion of the tribe of Judah, the one who killed a fig tree simply because it didn't bear fruit, the one who made a scene at the temple by turning over tables and whipping those who were selling animals for sacrifice, the one who raised an already stinking dead man to life, the one who said he was on a par with Yahweh, the one who made demands of his followers. He wasn't the peace and love hippie Jesus that a lot of people seem to want to follow these days. He was a man, a working man, a carpenter even, who built things and knew his way around tools. But he was also an army of one, whose heart of compassion drove him to tear down strongholds, to set free those who were captive, to loose those who were bound, to proclaim the arrival of the kingdom of God to those who were oppressed by the kingdoms of this world and the lies that they perpetuate. Those of us who've lived in North Alabama for any length of time know about storms. We know how fierce and how deadly they can be. April 27th, 2011 will forever be etched in our collective memory. But it's during these potentially deadly storms that we become acutely aware of just how small and insignificant we are in this vast and frightening universe. Now imagine being in the midst of one of these storms. As you look up into the sky, you're dwarfed by the enormity of the dangerous, massive darkness enveloping you. If you're like me, the blood drains from your face. Your bowels suddenly threaten to become active. It's the nicest way I knew how to put it. You are in fear for the lives of all those you love as well as yourself. Suddenly, someone standing by your side, perhaps your neighbor, perhaps somebody in your family, rebukes the storm. And you're like, but then it immediately fades away. The clouds part and the warmth of an early spring sun shines on your face. Now, I know I would certainly be so appreciative that somebody did that, but in my heart of hearts, I know also that this is somebody I'm just never quite going to be comfortable around. I might be downright scared of them. In fact, they may never be invited to my home for dinner. I mean, who does something like that? Not normal people. In the back of my mind, I'm probably thinking, who is this? And I might just also be thinking, get away from me. Just like Simon Peter did a few days earlier. You know the story. When he was fishing, they were catching nothing. Jesus says, throw your net on the other side of the boat. They do so. They catch so many fish that the boat begins to sink. And what does Peter say? Depart from me, Jesus, for I am a sinner. That would probably be somewhat close to what my response might be to something, if something like this happened. So they're in this boat, and it may be the same boat that Peter was in that day. I don't know. They're in this boat, and it was seemingly destined for the bottom of the sea. But then suddenly it was righted and everything's okay. Jesus does this as a demonstration of who he is. It is an object lesson for the disciples, pointing to something else that is about to happen that will again raise questions as to his true identity. Now, as soon as they come ashore, Jesus steps out of the boat. He is met by a man who is possessed by demons. Note the answer that is given when Jesus asks his name. Verse 30, Legion, for many demons had entered him. Jesus knew this, but he's doing it as a demonstration of what is about to happen. He simply asked the man his name. The man cannot even answer for himself. He has been completely absorbed by demonic forces. Revealing one's name to someone is one of the most basic aspects of proper social protocol. And yet this man is simply unable to perform even that task. This is how much his personality, his authentic personhood, has been compromised. He is unable even to speak for himself. We're told in verse 29 that he was so violent. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demons into the wild. Now, even though he had incredible strength so that nothing could bind his body, he was unable to break the chains that bound his spirit, that bound his mind, that bound the real person underneath the flesh. Do you know someone like that? Someone who is outwardly strong, except they're bound by something, perhaps an addiction, like alcohol, lust, food, wealth, or perhaps they're bound by jealousy, attention, drama. Aren't we all like that before being set free? We may not have been addicted to any of these things, but we were all in some way addicted to the self within who wants to be in control. And we may be still. In many ways, that addiction is so much worse than any of the others. It is the one addiction that is hardest to break, especially in America, where we're raised on a steady diet of individualism, taught to be masters of our own destiny, a nation of rights and freedom to be who we want to be. We're taught that we're to be in control. But look at what the demonic powers who had this man in bondage did to him. Verse 27. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house, but in the tombs. He had no home. He lived among the dead. He himself was dead. He just didn't know it. I wonder how many people we encounter every day who are in a similar situation. They are dead men walking, and they don't even realize it. How many people do we encounter each day who are naked and they don't know it? Now, they may not be literally naked, or in today's society, they might just be and no one cares. But they have at least reached the point where they have no shame. They have forgotten how to blush. There's nothing off limits to what they say, what they do, what they think. And in the Bible, nakedness is often associated with shame. When people ripped their garments because of some stressful or shameful or traumatic event, it was a way of saying, I bear my shame before the world in order that all may know. Now, this week I was reading in the Lutheran Study Bible. I'm not Lutheran. I just happen to have a Lutheran Study Bible. That says one of the signs of demon possession is a desire to frequent cemeteries. Well, that got my attention because I love cemeteries. I love visiting them. I love reading the dates and the epitaphs and trying to see what kind of person this was who inhabited that dash between the two dates. Call me morbid, but I like hanging out with the dead. I read a little further, though, and it said an additional sign was superhuman strength. So I knew I was off the hook then. As much as I love cemeteries, I have no desire to take up residence in one. That will come soon enough. As for the man in our passage today, the tombs, the graveyard, the cemetery was the only place he could live. Because the townspeople were so afraid of him, they wouldn't let him near their city. And of course, what are the dead going to do? It's the one place he didn't have to worry over complaints about his behavior. But Jesus isn't having it. He has compassion on the man. And he orders the foul spirits to come out of him. Now, here's where things begin to get a little creepy. These demonic spirits seem to want to negotiate with Jesus. Verse 28. What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me. And then in verse 30, they begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Well, where else are demons going to go if not back into the abyss? And we can certainly understand why they wouldn't want to go back there. Because they would no longer have free rein to do as they pleased. And after all, one of the traits of being under demonic influence, one of the authentic traits of being under demonic influence, is doing as one pleases without thought of anyone else. And this works for a little while until the demons themselves take complete control. And it almost appears as if Jesus is negotiating with them when he allows them to enter a herd of swine, pigs, on the nearby hillside. And just like the naked man in the tombs, the herd goes crazy. In verse 33, they rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Never tried to bargain with Jesus. He's a shrewd negotiator, as this legion of demons found out a little too late. Never tried to bargain with the devil either. Let Jesus do that. He's good at it, as we see here. The same Jesus who exercised power over the storm and calmed the water now uses that same water as an instrument in conquering the enemies of this man's soul. He won't have to worry about them anymore. And neither will the townspeople. But they still have a slight problem. Verses 34 and 35. When the swineherds, the herdsmen, saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Just as the disciples saw the instant calming of the storm and were struck with fear, so now the townspeople see the former demoniac delivered of his demons, and now they too are overcome with the same kind of fear. Why were they afraid? After all, they no longer had to worry about this man terrorizing their community. They should have been rejoicing, but they weren't. Nor does Luke say anything about the disciples at this point, whether they were rejoicing or not. One would think that this is the point at which the disciples begin to walk around amongst the townspeople saying, "We're with him. You think this is something? You don't know the half of it. But listen, I can get you his autograph, but it'll cost you." Not hardly. In reality, we have no information from Luke about how the disciples responded after having already been mortified by what Jesus did in the boat while at sea in the storm. They may not have even been aware of an exorcism taking place. Who knows? They may have still been talking about this storm that they just came through a little while ago. And in all likelihood, the fears of the disciples would not have been diminished in the least when they saw what Jesus did with this man. So, no one is rejoicing. No one is shouting the victory. Not the disciples, not the townspeople, except for the man who had been possessed by the demons. Now, why would they have not been rejoicing? They were scared for two reasons. One, they had grown comfortable with this demonic power who lived inside the man among the tombs. They had finally figured out how to control him and keep from getting molested by him. But what Jesus did was something else entirely. This was a power they had never witnessed before, like the disciples in the storm. It was beyond belief. This kind of power could not be controlled or manipulated by them, and it was more than they could bear. So, for them, it really was a case of better the devil you know. Have you ever met people who seem to have grown comfortable with their demons? They have figured out how to manage their lives around whatever those demons may be. Functioning alcoholics can't live without a drink, but they are able to manage to cover it up, get by. Porn addicts, able to function at work and with the family, but when they're alone. Or maybe they have anger issues that no one knows about. They can hide it, keep it from coming out, keep it from being out in the open by engaging in some passive-aggressive strategies with those who incur their secret wrath. They'd like to rid themselves of it. We all would. We just don't know how we'd live our lives apart from it. So first of all, they were afraid of a power that was beyond their control. Number two, this little episode had a major impact on the local economy. Mark's gospel tells us that the herd of pigs on the hillside numbered about 2,000. Now, when you lose that much livestock, there's no way it doesn't affect the economy. So important was it to the townspeople that while, yes, they were glad the man was back among the living, they really missed them pigs. In fact, they are so infuriated, in addition to being fearful, that they beg Jesus to leave them. Like Peter when he's fishing. Simply amazing. It reminds me of a similar argument we hear a lot nowadays. Well, of course, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but doing away with it altogether might hurt the state's economy. Like another argument heard a long time ago. Oh, yes, I'm opposed to slavery, but what are we going to do? What happens to the economy when we get rid of the slaves? These people, oh, sure, we're glad the man was delivered, but at what cost to our bank accounts? Ironically, the only one who seems to be thinking straight during this whole episode is the man who was just delivered from the demons. What is his response? He wants to stay with Jesus. Verse 38. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him. That seems like a reasonable request. Even though the townspeople want him gone, and the disciples, well, they're not sure yet what they want to do, and they still have to go back across the Sea of Galilee with Jesus. But Jesus sent him away, verse 39. Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. Now, if we're not careful, we'll miss the full import of what Jesus says here. There's no mistaking what has taken place. Jesus has delivered this man by casting out demons that had tormented him for years. But he tells the man to go to his home. He may have once had a wife and children, a job, neighbors with whom he cooked out on Saturdays, guys with whom he watched the games. And what is he to do when he gets there? Tell them what happened to you here today. Jesus doesn't tell him to go preach, doesn't tell him to start a Sunday school class, doesn't tell him to go to seminary and become a Bible scholar, doesn't even tell them to invite them to church. He has one job: tell others what God has done. Those of you who are college football fans, Saturday in the fall, game day, that segment that ESPN does, you had one job. And it's always funny segments about people who specialize in certain positions in sports. and some way they find a way to muck it all up. And it's hilarious. You know, I don't want to stand before God one day and the highlight reel comes on. Daryl Edward Veal, you had one job. But even if no one else was convinced by this man's testimony, which would be hard to believe, he was every bit the witness Jesus asked him to be simply because he did what was asked of him. He told what God had done for him. In closing, Luke adds one more sentence to this story. The second half of verse 39 reads, "So he went away," the man who had been delivered, "he went away proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him." The important thing here, the thing we can't miss, is that Jesus said, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." But Luke tells us that instead he went away proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. This is no accident. This is not a case of semantical wordplay. Right here at the very end of this incident recorded in Luke, there is a not so subtle hint of the true identity of this man who calmed the storm, who cast out demons, who raised the dead. That was who came ashore that day on the southeastern coast of Galilee. Jesus had shown his great power, but he had also shown his great compassion. The episode that day was a major hint to the disciples and to those Gentiles, as well as to us, as to the true identity of Jesus. As we stand, I don't know what your needs are this morning. I don't know what demons you're wrestling with. Addictions, disease, relationships, finances, assurance. I don't know. I don't have to know. I don't want to know. None of it is any of my business, nor anyone else's here, for that matter. I do know, though, this. Jesus has come ashore here this morning. And he is waiting to meet whatever needs we may have. If you want to pray, now's the time. If you want people to pray with you here in these altars, I guarantee you, you won't be down here alone. Somebody will come pray with you. And those who pray with you are not going to ask you to reveal your deepest, darkest secrets unless you want and need to tell them. But that's up to you. As for me, I'm going to be the first one in the altars this morning. Will you join me?